He insulted a woman in uniform without a second thought. By the next morning, a headline shattered his pride and left him drowning in guilt he couldn't escape. Houston's George Bush Intercontinental Airport was packed like a jar of marbles, every gate buzzing with people trying to make their way home, to work, or somewhere in between. Gate E14 was no different. The late evening flight to Charlotte was boarding, but a minor technical delay kept passengers standing around, shifting from foot to foot, clutching coffees and carry-ons. Trevor Aldridge, standing in the priority line, tapped his Rolex impatiently. His suit jacket was crisply pressed, shoes polished enough to catch the light from the overhead fluorescence. He checked his phone for the third time in 5 minutes, sighing dramatically. A missed call from a client blinked on his screen, but he ignored it. All he cared about now was getting to Charlotte in time for his meeting the next morning. The gate agent's voice crackled over the speaker. "We'll begin general boarding shortly. Thank you for your patience." Trevor muttered under his breath. "Yeah, some of us have things to do." Just as the line began creeping forward, a tall woman in military uniform approached, duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Staff Sergeant Renata Colby. Renata looked travel-worn but composed. Her posture was perfect, her boots scuffed but clean. A few people noticed her uniform and instinctively moved aside, offering quiet respect. Trevor, however, rolled his eyes. As she walked past him, adjusting the strap on her bag, Trevor couldn't resist. "Priority boardings for paying customers," he said, just loud enough for her, and a few others, to hear. The words hung there, sour and heavy. A woman nearby tightened her grip on her purse. A man in a ball cap shifted awkwardly. No one said anything. Renata stopped for a fraction of a second, just enough to hear it clearly. Her jaw twitched, but she didn't turn around. She just kept walking, scanning her boarding pass and moving down the jet bridge. Trevor smirked, amused by his own comment. He turned to the man behind him, expecting some kind of validation. But the man just looked away, pretending to study the flight information screen. Boarding continued in strained silence. As Trevor stepped onto the plane, he noticed Renata a few rows ahead, stuffing her bag into the overhead bin with practiced efficiency. She slid into her middle seat, her expression neutral, hands folded in her lap. She wasn't looking at anyone. Trevor found his seat several rows back. First class. Window seat. He plopped down with a grunt and loosened his tie. To him, this was just another annoyance of travel, another story to laugh about later at the bar with his colleagues. But something about the way the others had reacted, the way the energy in the line had shifted, left a faint prickle in the back of his mind. Still, he shook it off. He had more important things to focus on. The flight attendants finished their safety demonstration. The plane finally pushed back from the gate, engines rumbling to life. As they taxied to the runway, Trevor glanced forward again. Renata was staring out of the window, expression unreadable. It didn't matter to him. People were too sensitive these days anyway, he thought. He leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes, and let the vibration of the plane lull him into a light, restless sleep as they lifted into the dark Texas sky. But Trevor had no idea that tomorrow morning one headline would tear his world apart in a way he never saw coming. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft ding, and passengers immediately began reaching for headphones, laptops, and snacks, eager to lose themselves in anything but the cramped reality of the flight. But not everyone forgot. A few rows behind Renata, an elderly woman with silver hair kept glancing up from her crossword puzzle, stealing quick looks toward the soldier. She seemed to fidget with her pen a little more than necessary. A young man in a faded Red Sox hoodie across the aisle leaned his head back, but didn't close his eyes. He kept peeking over, almost as if weighing whether he should have spoken up earlier. The air inside the cabin felt heavier than it should for a routine flight. It wasn't noisy. In fact, it was almost too quiet. Little pockets of conversation here and there, the hum of air vents overhead, the occasional rattling cart from the flight attendants. Yet the tension from Trevor's comment clung to the atmosphere like humidity before a storm. Renata sat in silence. She didn't pull out a book. She didn't scroll through her phone. She simply sat there, hands folded neatly, staring at nothing in particular. Inside, though, her mind raced. She had spent 15 years serving a country where moments like this were still far too common. She had carried wounded soldiers on her back through mortar fire, sat by the bedsides of young recruits who didn't make it, and written letters home to families she knew she could never console. Yet here she was, in uniform, getting side-eyed by a man who thought he could measure her worth with a single sentence. Renata blinked slowly, willing herself not to let it get under her skin. She wasn't about to cause a scene. She wasn't about to stoop down to pettiness. She had survived too much for that. The woman with the crossword finally tore a piece of paper from the corner of her puzzle book and scribbled something. A few minutes later, as she headed toward the restroom, she casually dropped it onto Renata's tray table without saying a word. Renata glanced down. In messy handwriting, it simply read, "Thank you for your service." A tightness formed in her chest that had nothing to do with anger. She tucked the note into her pocket without looking around. She didn't want pity. She didn't want attention. She just wanted respect. Silent, simple, real. Meanwhile, Trevor popped open a can of club soda and scrolled through emails on his tablet. A minor smirk still played on his lips. In his world, first impressions were made through business cards, watches, and mutual LinkedIn connections, not dusty boots and military patches. As the cabin lights dimmed, Trevor adjusted his seat, set his tablet aside, and let himself relax. The flight was uneventful for him, just another line on his calendar. He didn't notice the way conversations stayed hushed around Renata. He didn't catch the sideways glances thrown in his direction by those who had heard him earlier. He didn't realize that sometimes silence isn't ignorance, it's disappointment. The plane glided smoothly through the dark, speckled sky, tracing a silver line across the southern states. Somewhere below, tiny towns blinked with sleepy lights, unaware of the small, quiet battles happening thousands of feet above them. Renata finally leaned her head back and closed her eyes, willing herself to leave it behind. She had more important things waiting for her. People she loved, a life she was proud of. This flight, this moment, it would not define her. But in the back of her mind, she wondered how many more times she would have to endure these small cuts, these sharp words thrown like rocks at her dignity. What Renata didn't know was that life had its own way of bringing truth to light, sometimes quicker than anyone expects. The wheels of the plane screeched softly against the runway as they touched down at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. It was nearly midnight, and most passengers were already half asleep, heads bobbing with each bump of the landing. Trevor Aldridge stretched his arms, popped his neck side to side, and checked his watch. 12 minutes ahead of schedule. Not bad. He grabbed his briefcase from under the seat and stood up the second the seatbelt sign blinked off, impatient to get off the plane and into his hotel bed. Around him, people slowly filed into the narrow aisle. Some were polite, waving others ahead. Others, like Trevor, nudged forward, eager to be first through the bottleneck. He barely spared a glance at the woman in uniform, still seated a few rows ahead, waiting for her turn to stand. Renata stayed seated, hands resting quietly on her knees. She wasn't in a rush. The world had taught her long ago that sometimes it's better to let the storm pass before you move. She caught a few more glances from passengers around her, not pitying, not curious, just aware. She preferred it that way. Awareness, at least, was a start. Trevor finally reached the exit, offering the tired flight attendant a quick, distracted, "Thanks," before stepping briskly into the jet bridge. The heavy, warm air of the terminal hit him like a wall. He shrugged his bag higher onto his shoulder and made a beeline for baggage claim. He had a car service waiting. He didn't even think about Renata again as he powered through the terminal, weaving around slower travelers and dragging his rolling suitcase behind him. To Trevor, the night was just beginning. He had emails to answer, a client dinner to confirm, and a morning full of meetings stacked one after another. He saw the soldier, all right. But in his mind, She was just another face on another flight he would forget by the time he finished his second whiskey at the hotel bar. Outside the terminal, a thick layer of humidity clung to the air. Trevor climbed into the black town car waiting at the curb, barely acknowledging the driver before diving into his phone again. "Marriott Uptown," he said without looking up. The driver nodded and pulled into traffic, the city lights blurring past the windows. Meanwhile, inside the terminal, Renata sat on a metal bench near baggage claim, waiting for her single beat-up duffel bag to appear on the carousel. She didn't mind the wait. She pulled out the crumpled note from her pocket again, smoothing the paper flat against her palm. "Thank you for your service." Simple words. But when spoken sincerely, or written by a stranger who noticed, they meant more than 1,000 apologies ever could. Her bag finally rolled out. She grabbed it with one hand and headed for the exit, boots clicking softly against the polished floor. No fancy car service waited for her, no plush hotel room, just a 2-hour drive to her small rental outside Hickory, North Carolina, where her dog and a well-worn recliner were waiting. The contrast between Trevor's night and Renata's couldn't have been sharper. One moved through life assuming the world owed him something. The other had given pieces of herself away for years without ever asking for anything in return. But neither of them knew that by the next sunrise, the wall between their worlds would come crashing down. Because fate, and a single news story, had a way of making sure that when you finally see someone clearly, it's already too late to pretend you didn't. And the truth, when it hit Trevor, wouldn't come gently. It would hit like a punch straight to the heart. The next morning broke without ceremony. A weak sun struggled against the heavy Carolina clouds as commuters poured onto the streets of Concord, just outside Charlotte. Trevor Aldridge sat alone at a corner table inside a cozy cafe called Milltown Brew, tucked between a pharmacy and a vintage furniture store. He wasn't a man who usually lingered over breakfast, but today he had a little time to kill before his meetings kicked off. He sipped black coffee, scrolled absently through emails on his phone, and barely registered the low murmur of other customers around him. Deals, deadlines, dinner reservations. His mind moved from one task to another without really landing anywhere. That was, until a notification popped up on his news feed. At first he ignored it. Another headline about politics, another celebrity scandal, nothing new. But as he took another absent-minded sip of coffee, a name caught his eye. Local soldier honored for heroism in attack overseas. Underneath the headline was a photo. Trevor's hand froze mid-air. It was her. There was no mistaking it. The same steely gaze, the same neatly pressed uniform from last night's flight. Staff Sergeant Renata Colby. He clicked the article. His heart started pounding so loudly he could barely hear the music playing overhead in the cafe. Staff Sergeant Renata Colby, a decorated combat medic with over 15 years of service, was recognized yesterday for her extraordinary bravery during a surprise mortar attack on a U.S. base in Eastern Europe. Despite heavy fire, Colby rescued 12 soldiers, administering life-saving aid and personally carrying 3 wounded men to safety under relentless assault. The words blurred slightly as Trevor stared at the screen. She had saved lives, risked everything, faced bullets and bombs while he had whined about flight delays and cracked cheap insults at an airport gate. He scrolled further down the article. There was a quote from her commanding officer. "She's the reason some of our guys made it home. She didn't think twice. That's who she is." Trevor set the phone down slowly, hands trembling slightly. He couldn't remember the last time his chest felt this tight. The cafe's background chatter melted into a distant buzz. He thought back to the night before, her calm face, her silent patience, how he had looked right past her, how he had assumed without asking, spoken without thinking. The memory of his own voice, smug, dismissive, replayed in his head like a cruel joke. "Priority boardings for paying customers." He felt sick. Trevor pushed his coffee aside. Appetite gone. Pride gone. A sudden heavy wave of shame crashed over him, and for the first time in a long time, he had no defense ready, no excuse sharp enough to cut through the truth staring him in the face. He buried his face in his hands. For a moment, it didn't matter that he was sitting in public, in a nice suit, at a polished table. He was small, smaller than he had ever felt. It wasn't just the insult. It wasn't just the ignorance. It was the realization that he had become the kind of person he once swore he'd never be. Someone who measured worth in status, appearances, and assumptions. Trevor squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he could rewind the clock. Wishing he could grab himself by the shoulders at that gate and shake some decency back into his own bones. But wishing changed nothing. He picked up his phone again, scrolling back to Renata's picture. The faintest smile ghosted across her face in the photo. Not a smile for the camera, but a smile like she carried something deeper inside. Strength, faith, grace. And he had disrespected that. The weight of it settled deep in his chest, heavy and unmoving. But guilt alone wasn't enough to undo the harm. If Trevor wanted to be better, he had to find a way to confront what he had become, no matter how uncomfortable it made him. Trevor sat frozen in that corner booth for what felt like an hour. His fingers curled and uncurled around his coffee cup, but the coffee had long since gone cold. A couple of people came and went at nearby tables, but he barely noticed. The truth had hit him too hard. He stared down at the phone again, reading every line of the article, every word about Renata's courage, hoping somehow that it would soften the sting in his chest. But it didn't. It only made it worse. He thought back to his own life, his carefully crafted world of boardrooms, quarterly earnings, golf trips, cocktail receptions. He had spent years convincing himself that success meant he had nothing left to learn from anyone. He had built walls, neat and tall, around his comfortable little kingdom. And then, with one casual insult and one news story, the walls cracked open. He pushed his chair back, letting it scrape loudly against the hardwood floor. Heads turned, but he didn't care. He needed air. He needed space. He needed something to explain how he could feel so hollow so quickly. Outside, the morning traffic hummed along the main street. Trevor stood under the awning of the cafe, running a hand down his face. The weight in his chest didn't lift. He thought about Renata sitting there on the plane, quiet, still, absorbing his words like one more blow she didn't deserve. He imagined how many times in her life she had been forced to swallow disrespect and keep moving, because showing anger would only feed more ignorance. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And for once, Trevor wasn't going to lie to himself about it. He paced the sidewalk for a moment, then pulled his phone back out. His fingers hovered over the screen. He searched her name. Staff Sergeant Renata Colby. Pages of articles flooded the screen. News outlets from Raleigh, Greensboro, even national coverage. Her story was everywhere. Her bravery, her selflessness, her refusal to leave anyone behind. Trevor's stomach twisted again. He wanted to say something, to apologize, but what could he say? Sorry I treated you like less than a person before I knew you were a hero? The cowardice of the thought made his face burn. He realized, bitterly, that he wanted forgiveness for his own comfort, not because he deserved it. He sank down onto a bench outside the cafe, the morning breeze brushing the back of his neck. His mind wouldn't stop replaying the scene at the gate. Her standing there, her bag slung over one shoulder, the ugly words tumbling out of his mouth like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was a crack in the foundation of who he thought he was. Trevor clenched his hands into fists, then released them slowly. For years, he had coasted through life believing he was a good man because he followed the rules, paid his taxes, shook hands at charity events. But true character wasn't measured by the grand gestures you made when everyone was watching. It was measured by the small moments, the unnoticed ones, the ones where no one was keeping score. And he had failed. Badly. But recognizing the truth was only the first step. What Trevor chose to do next would decide whether he stayed the man he had just seen clearly for the first time, or became someone better. Trevor sat hunched forward on the weathered bench, the sounds of morning life carrying on around him. Car horns, distant barking dogs, people ordering breakfast sandwiches from food trucks across the street. It all felt strangely far away, like he was watching the world through a window he couldn't open. He opened his phone again and searched for anything. An email, a social media page, a way to reach Renata Colby. He knew it was a long shot. Someone who had lived through what she had probably wasn't posting weekend selfies or LinkedIn updates. Still, he tried. Nothing personal came up. Only news articles, a few military press releases, and one grainy video clip from a local ceremony where her commander pinned another medal to her chest. Trevor sat back, defeated. He realized then that sometimes you don't get the chance to apologize. Sometimes, when you hurt someone, they walk out of your life without ever looking back. And you're left sitting with the weight of it, forced to carry it alone. It wasn't about him fixing his guilt. It was about recognizing the hole he had dug and learning how to climb out without expecting someone else to pull him up. He thought about writing a letter, maybe contacting the base where she was stationed and sending something. But what would he even say? "I'm sorry I disrespected you before I knew you were important." It sounded hollow, even in his own head. Trevor stood up and shoved the phone into his pocket. He crossed the street and started walking, not really caring where. Past brick storefronts, past a barber shop just opening its doors for the day, past a church with a crooked sign that read, "Character is what you do when nobody is watching." He stopped cold. The message hit him harder than anything he'd read that morning. Character isn't about apologies when you're caught. It's about who you are when no one's clapping for you, when there's no headline, no camera, no pat on the back. That was where he had gone wrong. Not just in that moment at the airport, in hundreds of moments before it. He had gotten used to measuring people by titles, salaries, appearances. If someone didn't fit his narrow vision of success, he brushed them aside without a second thought. Renata had exposed that flaw in him simply by existing, by standing there in her worn boots and her quiet strength. And the worst part was, he knew there were thousands more like her. People he had probably overlooked, dismissed, judged without knowing the first thing about their lives. Trevor kept walking, hands shoved deep in his pockets. He knew he couldn't erase what he had said. He couldn't take back the look she must have seen on his face, the sting of those words. But maybe he could start by never making that mistake again. By seeing people, really seeing them, instead of making lazy judgments at a glance. Maybe he couldn't find Renata Colby to say he was sorry. But he could make sure the next Renata he met would only see respect in his eyes. That had to mean something. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't enough to balance the scales, but it was a step. A real one. He pulled out his phone one last time before heading into his meeting. He opened a blank note and typed a few words. Words he never wanted to forget. Speak less. Listen more. Assume nothing. Respect always. Trevor locked the screen, took a deep breath, and slipped the phone into his jacket. Today was just the first day. The real work was going to take much longer. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice told him it wasn't too late to start becoming the man he should have been all along. The meeting room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and dry erase markers. Trevor sat through the first 15 minutes barely hearing a word. The client's voice droned on about numbers and projections, but Trevor's mind wasn't there. It kept drifting back. To the gate, to the plane, to the silent strength sitting just a few rows ahead. For the first time in a long time, Trevor wasn't thinking about contracts or closing deals. He was thinking about how easily we overlook the people standing right next to us, how fast we are to judge, how slow we are to understand. He looked around the room. Suits and ties, neat haircuts, polished shoes. A week ago, he would have only noticed who looked important, who mattered to his career. Today, he noticed something different. Who looked tired. Who looked like they were carrying something heavy. Who didn't speak unless spoken to. Trevor adjusted his tie and sat up a little straighter. Not to impress anyone, but to pay attention, to be better. After the meeting ended, he didn't rush out the door like he usually did. He lingered, shook a few hands, asked a couple of assistants how their mornings were going. Not because he needed anything, but because they deserved to be seen. It was a small start. A quiet one, but that was the point. The biggest changes don't come with fireworks. They come with the slow rebuilding of habits, the steady rewriting of who you are at your core. Trevor wasn't going to fix everything in a day. He wasn't going to erase every careless word he'd spoken over the years. But he could refuse to add new ones. And maybe, just maybe, the next time he crossed paths with someone like Staff Sergeant Renata Colby, he'd meet their eyes with nothing but genuine respect. No assumptions, no walls, no hesitation. The morning wore on, and life went back to its usual rhythm. But something inside Trevor had shifted for good. He knew now that true strength isn't loud or boastful. It doesn't always wear a badge or a medal. Sometimes it sits quietly by the window on a late-night flight, carrying the weight of sacrifices no one else can see. And if you're lucky enough to cross paths with that kind of strength, the very least you can do, the very least, is treat it with the dignity it deserves. As Trevor left the office building later that day, the sky had turned a softer blue. The city bustled around him, strangers moving in a dozen different directions. He didn't see a sea of faces anymore. He saw individuals, stories, battles won and battles still being fought, all hidden under the surface, and he promised himself, from that day forward, to never again mistake silence for weakness, nor a uniform for just another outfit, nor a stranger for someone unworthy of kindness. Some lessons come easy. Some carve their way into you the hard way. But the ones that stay, the ones that truly change you, are the ones you earn through humility, discomfort, and the willingness to face your own reflection. And maybe today is the perfect day for all of us to ask ourselves, how do we treat the people we don't know? The ones we pass by at the airport, the grocery store, the sidewalk? Are we really seeing them, or just rushing past? If this story made you think, even for a moment, then maybe you're ready too. Ready to listen more. Assume less. Respect always. Thanks for being here. If you believe stories like these matter, make sure to subscribe for more. And don't forget, sometimes the biggest difference you can make in someone's life is simply treating them like they matter.